What's up creators, I hope you're doing well. Today we're returning to the analog styles in the Airlight series. We're going to try to replicate FANTOME KINO from Lomography. Now this black and white film produces some of the most contrasty, dramatic and intense looking images that I've seen at the cost of a lot of latitude of exposure or dynamic range. So what we're going to do first of all is check out some images shot with this film stock just to break down and analyze the main characteristics, and then we're going to apply that knowledge when we jump into Lightroom, edit a photo and create a preset out of it. So here we have some images shot with FANTOME KINO, and it produces very contrasty and dramatic looking images, very interesting. But as you can see, we're losing a lot of information in the whites and in the blacks. Notice how the sky doesn't have a single cloud, don't have even the slightest of gradient, and the same thing occurs with the blacks. Now, this film stock has an incredibly low 8 of ISO. This is the lowest ISO I've seen in a film stock. My digital camera can't even go that far. And as a consequence, this film stock is designed for daylight photography. And even so that if you're shooting in daylight photography, you're going to have a very hard time exposing correctly and having a lot of information in your image. For example, this image in particular, we have the source of light very close to the subject and we have a lot of diffusion, and there we can create very nicely exposed images. But in most of the cases in daylight photography, in landscapes, in portraits outside, we're going to have a lot of loss of information and a very contrasty and dramatic looking image. Now finally, this film stock produces one of the finest or unnoticeable grains that I've seen in any film, and as you can see, it's barely noticeable, it's minuscule, and it creates very clean images. So that's the style that we're going to try to replicate, and we're going to jump into Lightroom and start color grading. But before that, as always, I'm going to remind you that this preset that we're going to create today is included in the Airlight preset pack V3 and also the analog preset pack. Now in the analog preset pack, you're going to find all the film styles that we've replicated throughout the years, whether it be Kodak, the Portras, the Kodak Visions, Lomography, CineStill. All the presets that we've created are included in that pack. So that's a great way you can skip my tutorials, and in the process you can support me. So link up here to my shop. If you can purchase anything from there, I'm very thankful. If not, don't worry guys, let's jump into Lightroom and start editing. Okay creators, here I am in Lightroom Classic in the develop module, and don't worry if you're using Lightroom desktop, mobile or camera raw within Photoshop, it's exactly the same process, only the interface is a bit different. So I just picked a random image because I couldn't decide, but this one of my friend Patricio has a central subject, so it's good for the midtones, shadows and highlights. We have whites in the sky in the background, we have some blacks, so we have all the areas that we want to hit when creating the Lomography FANTOME KINO. So first of all, let's go with exposure and contrast, and we need to change this image into black and white. So the logical thing to do would be to move the saturation slider all the way to -100. But that's not what I'm going to do. I'm just going to select V on my keyboard, or otherwise just going to go into black and white over here, or in profile select Adobe Monochrome. So I like to work with the monochrome profile because it changes the way that Lightroom interprets the colors coming from the original file as black and white. Therefore, for example, vibrance and saturation, we cannot move them. In HSL, we don't have saturation or hue to move them around. So it's just changing a bit the way that Lightroom works. So Lightroom is just working with our image in a different spectrum, which is black and white. Now for this video, I'm going to break a bit my usual process where I go from the top sliders all the way to the down sliders in a sequential manner. In this case, I'm going to start off with the tone curve because this one is going to be the one that will change more dramatically our exposure. So the tone curve, if you don't know how it works, well, this line that we have over here, which is the curve, because if you add more points, it behaves like a curve. It represents our image in the exposure field. If we move our exposure upwards, we introduce more highlights, more brightness. If we move it downwards, we introduce more black. So it's very simple. This point over here controls the brightest points on our image, highlights, midtones, shadows, and then blacks. This point controls the deepest points on our exposure. So don't worry, in this case, we're not going to move too much. We're just going to move the white point over here. I'm not going to move it towards the negatives, otherwise we darken everything. And remember that this style is very punchy and contrasty. So I'm going to go towards the left, and immediately you can notice how our highlights, our whites start to overexpose, and we start to lose some detail in the white points on our image. So in this case, I'm not going to go too much, maybe around this value. The input is going to be 190, which is just the x-axis movement, and the output is 255, which is the maximum in the vertical axis. Then this point will control the blacks, so I'm not going to move it up, otherwise we'll introduce more brightness and gray out those blacks. We're going to go towards the right to introduce more punch. Not too much, otherwise, well, this is unusable, but maybe around the 30s is going to be enough. With Y on our keyboard, we can see the before and after, and as you can see, well, our original image is in color. So what I'm going to do is just change them, swap before and after settings, right click, swap before and after. I'm just going to change this one with V to monochrome, and then I'm going to swap them again. so we have a fair comparison. So at the right, we have our edit so far. At the left, we have our original image, just converted into black and white. And you can see the immediate difference. Notice the whites, how they're a lot more intense and dramatic, and the blacks as well. We're losing some information over here. More of a dramatic looking image, but we're not quite finished. We're gonna go up into the basic corrections over here, and the basic corrections, I like to use them normally just to create the basis of our edit. In this case, we're gonna use it to accentuate specific details in terms of exposure. Now, the top sliders, temperature, tint, exposure, and contrast, I like to leave them at 0 because, well, these are the ones that I'm going to use to compensate maybe if my image was poorly shot on field, which is the case. That's why we have already a 0.85 stops of exposure, but I don't want this 0.85 of exposure, which is just a correction for this image, to be applied into the other images that we apply this preset to. So I'm just going to omit these ones. Just imagine they're not here, and we're going to start off with highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. So first of all, right here, remember that in the example images, the whites and the blacks were very overexposed, but in the midtones, we had a lot more detail. Now, right here, we don't have a midtone slider, which is something I wish Lightroom had. We have instead highlights and shadows, which is just dividing midtones by the half. So what I'm gonna do is bring up a bit more information in the shadows towards the positives, not towards the negatives, but a bit towards the positives. We have more detail in the midtones on our image. Around the plus 25 is gonna be the value. And then the highlights, well, highlights will have a bit of the skin tones. So what I'm gonna do, for example, over here, is play around with them, not too towards the positives, a bit towards the negatives, maybe around the -10, just to make sure that we have well lit or well exposed subjects in the center of our frame. Next up, we have here the whites and the blacks. Now I'm going to move these ones to accentuate a bit more the contrast and exposure or loss of information in our image. Now you may be asking, why move it over here if we can move it in the tone curve? Now there's a key difference. The sliders up here in the basic corrections are just hard stop. When we move the whites, we only move the whites. We're not going to move the shadows, we're not going to move the midtones or the highlights, and the same thing occurs with the blacks. In the tone curve, however, if you move the whites over here, as we move them over here, you can see how we affected also the highlight range, the midtone range, and by moving the blacks, we also affected the shadow range. So we have to keep in mind that the tone curve works as a sequential line or a curve that will affect the entirety of the image if you move a specific point, while the basic corrections are a lot more precise. So that's why I'm just going to accentuate a bit more the whites, just going to go towards the positives, and as you can see, the brightest points on our image are going to be affected around the plus 30, and then the blacks, I'm just going to drag them ever so slightly down to achieve more contrast in the dark points on our image, around the -27. So right here, our image is looking very dramatic in comparison to our original, and it's just looking fantastic, very intense, very dramatic. You guys can go ahead and add maybe more contrast if you wish, just move the sliders a bit more. But in this case, I like it like this. We have a very dramatic image, but not too harsh. Now, one thing that I have a bit of an issue is that this image is shot with a modern day sensor, a modern day lens. And as you can see, we have supreme sharpness and contrast and detail. We can see basically the skin pores, we can see the details around the nails. This is just basically a characteristic of modern day photography with high quality sensors that have sharpness, contrast, lenses that are very precise. And basically this is digital photography, and it's putting me off because we have all the sharpness and contrast, but we're trying to recreate an old look. So what I'm going to do is in the presence tab, the texture and the clarity, I'm not going to go towards the positives, otherwise we introduce more sharpness. Just going to go towards the negatives to make our image a bit more soft. Not too much, but maybe around the -20s, 25s is going to be enough. -25 with the texture, and clarity will add more contrast into the midtones. So I'm going to go again towards the negatives, not too much, otherwise it's very soft. Around the -25 is just going to be enough. And then I'm just going to add a bit more dehaze, and dehaze, what it's going to do is just create a bit of halation effect or simulated halation effect, and it's going to blur out a bit of the hard lines between the contrast. So right here we have brightness and black. Then if we add some dehaze, notice how they start to blend it just a bit more, and our borders become a bit more soft. So I'm just going to go again towards the negatives, not too much, just around the -10 is going to be enough. And if you compare it to our original image, notice the sharpness over here, how our original image is a bit more contrasty and detailed. Now we have a softer looking image, a bit more similar to the analog film photos. Okay, so the image is looking fantastic. One thing that remains is the grain. Now the grain, we're going to go all the way down to the effects tab down here. And remember that the grain was very fine, but it was present. So I'm just going to zoom in just a bit. And naturally, if we zoom in enough, we can see that there is some grain just because we have 100 ISO in this digital image. I'm just going to add a bit more noise over here. So I'm going to add some quantity just to see what we're looking at. And the size, we're gonna play around. This is way too much, it's too big, too distracting. We need to scale it down just a bit. So I'm gonna go maybe around the 15. We zoom in, there it is. And then the quantity again is way too much. Reduce it, around 10% is gonna be just enough. So if we zoom in, we can see that very fine grain around the image, just giving it a nice texture over here. But if we zoom out, it's basically unnoticeable. Okay, so the preset is basically complete. Now let's save it and apply it into a couple of other images to see if we did a good job. So to save a preset, we can go into the left panel over here. On the preset, select the plus sign and create preset. Now down here, we don't want to mark anything that we didn't use. Remember that 3 sliders, white balance, exposure, and contrast, that I can leave unmarked to compensate any miss shooting on field. Want to uncheck them, and we're gonna hit create. Okay, so here I have this image. Now let's apply the preset. It's already in the AI preset pack v3, and immediately you can notice how dramatic it looks. It makes our images look very intense, very dramatic. And what I love about black and white photography is that by stripping away the colors, it allows the viewer to concentrate on the photo, in the expressions, on the subject. So this is just looking incredibly intense and dramatic. I don't care that we have some overexposure, some underexposure, because it's creating a very intense looking image, and we're preserving the midtones, which is the part that we actually want to have a great deal of detail. However, over here, I'm expecting to see a lot of overexposure over here. Let's apply FANTOME KINO. And yeah, we have a very dramatic and contrasty image, but I'm okay with it because it's exactly what the FANTOME KINO does. We're just concentrated in a subject, creating very intense blacks, very intense whites. And remember that you can always play around with the mount slider up here to change the intensity, making it a lot more intense or a lot more soft towards the negatives. It all depends on what you're going for. Okay, this image is shot more at sundown, although the FANTOME KINO is more for daylight photography, but this preset in digital photography works quite well as well. So let's apply FANTOME KINO, and you can notice that it creates a very dramatic looking image. And again, you can play around with the amount slider, or you can play around with the contrast slider over here to create even more of a dramatic look, more intense. Basically, this is looking fantastic, very stylized, but I like it a lot. So there you have it, guys, a very quick video on the FANTOME KINO to start off the year. I hope you achieved some knowledge out of this video. And just as a reminder, this preset is already in the AI preset pack v3, but also the analog preset pack. Link up here to my shop. Just browse around, maybe you find my personal presets, my LUTs that I use every single day helpful. And if you can support me by purchasing anything over there, I'd be very thankful, because we all know that YouTube AdSense doesn't pay much. And if you can't, don't worry, guys, just like the video, comment down below anything, share it with a friend, or maybe share it on a Facebook group or on social media. That actually helps me out quite a bit. And that's it for today. I'm Fuentes. Cheers to all of you, and I'll see you in the next one.